Hi, Jeremy, and thank you for being here today. So, first of all, what is your general response to the recent defence and security review?
It fails to address what is real security and what is real defence. Security is your ability to eat, to have somewhere to live, for your children to be educated, to have healthcare available, and be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water. That's what real security is. Millions of people around the world don't enjoy that security. And so a security review is important because you've got to look at what are the issues around the world, what are the likely causes of future conflict around the world, human rights abuses, environmental degradation, unbelievable levels of poverty, inequality, and global pandemics. And indeed, in 2008, the British government was warned then that the real problems in the world were actually a novel virus and a pandemic. They made no preparations for it whatsoever, and we saw the consequences of that last year when the pandemic finally came. And so I think the security review should have taken longer and gone into a much wider spectrum of issues. Secondly, that the problems are much more likely in the future to be cyber attacks and random acts of violence and terror. But instead, what we have is a plan to increase the number of nuclear warheads, contrary to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What we have is a plan to extend Britain's military role to a global one by increasing arms expenditure yet again and making us one of the highest arms spending countries in the world, and starting to send naval ships all around the world, beginning with the aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, being sent to the South China Sea. It seems to me a very, very odd way of approaching the future. Surely we should be looking to what we can do to create a more peaceful world, what we can do to work with and within the UN on this, and listen to Antonio Guterres' call for a global ceasefire at the start of the pandemic. I find it very sad they're also proposing increasing arms exports. The consequence of arms exports are export arms to Saudi Arabia, they kill people in Yemen. I'm pleased we're providing aid for Yemen, but we're dropping the bombs in the first place. And lastly, what kind of message is it that we reduce expenditure on overseas aid and increase expenditure on arms?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I was actually going to come on to say, well, a centerpiece of the announcement was a massive rise in spending on a huge increase in nuclear warheads, breaking the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, what do we really need to be saying about this?
The Non-Proliferation Treaty was a very far-sighted document produced actually at the height of the Cold War, 1968, promoted actually by Harold Wilson and the Labour government at the time, which had many contradictory positions on many things, but did promote the concept of nuclear disarmament. And from that has been the growth of nuclear-free zones in Africa, in Latin America, in Central Asia, which have made a big step forward. The vast majority of the world's countries have signed the NPT and adhered to the NPT. So the NPT is there to prevent proliferation. The 5 declared nuclear weapon states, China, France, Britain, the United States, and Russia, have by and large not fully adhered to the NPT because they have not taken significant steps towards disarmament, although at various times there has been quite a big reduction in warheads. But Britain alone is now increasing its warheads. What our media hardly ever report is the global ban movement, which is huge. 86 countries supported the treaty concept of a global treaty to ban the holding and use of nuclear weapons in all circumstances. Almost 60 countries have ratified that treaty, so it is now existing as a treaty. The 5 declared nuclear weapon states refused even to engage with this process. And so opinion polls in Britain, which don't get a lot of coverage in much of our media, show that over 77% of our population support the idea of global ban. Amongst Labour voters, it's even higher. And so why we should head in a direction of nuclear rearmament at a time when the rest of the world is going in the direction of nuclear disarmament seems to me missing the boat entirely. If this is dressed up in some sort of patriotic fervor that we need these weapons, well, patriotism is many things. Patriotism is about making sure your compatriots, your fellow citizens, are housed, are fed, are clothed, are in good health, and we don't pass by on the other side to poverty. Patriotism is ensuring everybody enjoys a reasonable standard of living. And I think it's time that we change the dial a bit, because the young people of this planet are not thirsting for war. They're thirsting for environmental sustainability, a good future, and peace.
Thanks, Jeremy. And this approach is part of a wider increasing in military spending, even at this time of the pandemic, and after recently cutting international development spending. What does that say about the Tories' priorities?
Well, it says basically everything about the Tories' priorities when they cut expenditure on overseas aid and increase expenditure on arms, and claiming it's making us all much safer. I don't believe it is. I do believe that our participation in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, our participation in the bombing of Libya and the bombing of Syria have not made the world a safer place. They've made the world actually an infinitely more dangerous place. I was no supporter of Saddam Hussein. I was no supporter of the human rights abuses that the Iraqi regime did. I took part in demonstrations in support of the people of Iraq. I opposed British arms sales to Iraq. And yet now, somehow or other, this war is seen to be something that's long past and forgotten. I remember, like it was yesterday, standing in Hyde Park saying, unleashing bombs on Iraq will set forth a cycle of terrorism, of poverty, of despair, of refugees, and ultimately will lead to the wars of tomorrow. Where was I wrong?
Yeah, and so many of us stood with you. I remember that day, actually. I was very young, but I was out marching in London, and it's just frightening what's happened since. But also, campaigners have pointed out what was missing from Boris Johnson's announcement, such as a clear agenda for tackling the climate emergency. So what do you think were the main gaps in it?
Main gaps were the lack of any analysis of the issues facing the world in terms of human rights abuses, in terms of environmental disaster and climate emergency, or the real reason why people have to seek refuge. There are 70 million refugees around the world at the present time, largest ever in history. But let's deal with the climate emergency first. This year we've got COP26 in Glasgow, and the Tories are getting into a bit of a panic because they're going to have to face the rest of the world and the civil society of the rest of the world in Glasgow in November. It's not very far away, and they're going to have to come up with some answers. And so they're now saying that there's going to be a big improvement in emissions by 2030. Good. We ought to be aiming for net zero by 2030, which is what we were proposing in the general election. And by not proposing that, they are then desperately casting around to create some figures that give the illusion that things are going better. Now, yes, I support electric vehicles. Yes, I support the transition of our economy to a low carbon, zero carbon economy. But I'm also very concerned that we delude ourselves by increasing imports of goods from countries that do not have any aspiration to reducing the levels of emissions to that which we need to. And in effect, what we're doing in many ways is exporting pollution. And so when we talk about global trade, we've got to think about the long-term implications of that. And also, it isn't just about emissions and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's also about our levels of biodiversity, because the levels of extinction amongst the mammal population have been massive. In my lifetime, 70% of extinctions that have ever happened have taken place. over millions of years, there's been extinctions, but 70% of those have happened in the last 70 years. The levels of biodiversity are reducing all the time. The level of insect life is reducing all the time. The farming methods we promote degrade our soil and make it less productive in the long run, therefore demanding more chemical fertilizers in order to continue to produce. We need a change in attitudes. A change in attitudes actually leads to more productive soil and more productive farming. Now, this might sound all a bit arcane, but actually it's central to everything we do. But do you know what? When I go into primary and secondary schools in my community and I ask the kids about this, they give me lectures on biodiversity. I remember going to a primary school last year and the kids gave me a wonderful lesson in biodiversity. I was very, very impressed with them. I went into the same school 10 years ago and I asked a class, what do you think about biodiversity? What do you think about insects? Absolute blank faces. They said, well, sir, we don't like them. They had no feeling or concept at all. So well done, a whole generation of teachers that have changed so many attitudes amongst so many children towards the natural world and their environment.
Well, I was watching a documentary on Cuba recently, and you forget, and it kind of gets forgotten about how much Cuba did, especially when Fidel Castro was around. And you know, really focusing on productive soil, you know, productive farming, and it was really fantastic when you look at what they were actually doing in Cuba at that time.
I first went to Cuba in the 1980s when it was just about to head into the special period, and I've been twice since then. And up until the 1980s, they were very much part of the Comecon system and importing a lot of stuff from Eastern Europe, which I could see why they did it, but it wasn't really a very good idea. They would have been better off producing far more themselves and going away from sugar into agricultural biodiversity. And I remember long discussions with farmers and others in my first visit in the 1980s. I was back there twice years later. I was so impressed with the biodiversity, so impressed with the food production system in Havana. So a city the size of Havana becomes self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables because they use every piece of land to grow stuff in a very good way. And it creates a much nicer city, but it also makes an awful lot of sense economically. So you're not shipping in lettuces from goodness knows where and apples from goodness knows where, you're growing them. Things can change when people put their mind to it. There is usually a natural answer to things. So use technology to find the natural answer.
And to sum up, Jeremy, so what then would be an approach of a government that would provide real security, going back to the security question?
First of all, examine the issues facing the world. Bring in popular views on that. Secondly, an international strategy and foreign policy that supports and defends human rights defenders around the world and make that part of the dialogue with all countries. And during my period as leader of the Labour Party, I met many international leaders. I met President Xi, I met Prime Minister Modi, I met President Obama, and many others. And the one common theme to all my meetings was I raised human rights issues with them. It was quite a complicated and quite difficult conversation with all three, but you've got to have it. Yeah. And they said, well, what's your government going to do then? I said, I'll be back here with a big agenda on human rights. And if you've got human rights concerns about my country, you bring them to me as well. Because, you know, none of us are perfect. Secondly, we would be much more assertive on the issues of environmental sustainability, biodiversity, and reaching net zero by 2030, and encouraging a trade policy that builds on that rather than damages that. Thirdly, we would be adhering to the Global Ban Treaty, because I would see that as a way forward, and I would be part of that persuasive negotiation to persuade the other declared nuclear weapon states, plus India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel to become part of that. And our armed forces include wonderful people with amazing skills. And I remember talking to people in the Navy who had just come back from the Mediterranean, where they've been plucking refugees out of the sea on the coast between Libya and Italy. And I said to this guy, who'd been 20 years in the Navy. I said, what was it like? And he said, interesting, frightening, but you know what, Mr. Corbyn? It was the most useful thing I ever did in all my years in the Navy. And so there are great skills in our armed forces that need to be put to good use. They've shown what they can do in the pandemic. They've shown what they can do when the floods come up. And Italy, for example, purposes its big naval vessels to also be hospital ships, so that when there's a crisis somewhere in the world, they can go there and be a hospital ship. So there's a lot we can do. And I'm quite serious about real defense, which is preventing cyber attacks on us. It is making sure that there aren't any random acts of terror. And so it is about being serious about that, but it's also, above all, about cooperation and education for global citizenship.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, incredibly interesting. Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you very much for what you do.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Good luck to Harlow.